Today we're going to review the two Greek tragedies that we read last week, Iphegenia at Aulis and Electra. We're going to start by going over some of the themes that are found in the play by Euripides, and then we'll move to the Sophocles play in just a moment. So, the first theme I'd like to go over is fate versus free will. We have seen this theme in Oedipus, we've seen this theme in Antigone, and now we see this theme not hit quite as hard in Iphigenia, but still it is there. First, we know that Agamemnon is faced with two terrible choices: to sacrifice his army and his brother's hopes, or to sacrifice his daughter. Remember that because of his actions, killing a deer that is sacred to Artemis, that the goddess Artemis has said that she will not allow the Greek army to embark on its voyage to Troy, and that means for Agamemnon's brother Menelaus that he won't be able to right the wrong that is done to him. He won't be able to retrieve his wife. He won't be able to regain his honor. On the other hand, in order to appease Artemis, she has asked for the sacrifice of his oldest daughter, Iphigenia, and that seems like a worse fate than not being able to embark on this military campaign. We know that the seer, Calchas, has, and this is before the play begins, he has made clear that there's only one solution to the problem confronting the army. Agamemnon's oldest daughter, Iphigenia, must be sacrificed to the goddess Artemis. And so that is your fate. I've seen this. It has to happen. Otherwise, you aren't going to win. You aren't going to even ever leave Greece. And then finally, there's the question of whether Iphigenia has any real choice as to whether she is a sacrifice or not. You read the play, you know that she chooses to be the sacrifice, but did she really have a choice? Was it really a free will choice that she had? The second theme that I'd like to discuss briefly is the theme of public versus personal duty. For Agamemnon, there's a struggle between duty as a father to protect his daughter and duty to his men to get them safely to Troy and back. We saw in the play how Agamemnon wept over the decision whether to sacrifice Iphigenia or not. As a father, he didn't want to do that. He was pressured into it by his brother Menelaus, and he later is pressured by the army to go ahead and make that sacrifice. Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, argues that one's first duty is to their immediate family, and she has a point there. And finally, when Iphigenia sees the thousands of soldiers ready to go to their deaths fighting for Greece, she realizes that she can do no less. Her conversion to public duty is a pure conversion. She's doing it out of pure motives, in other words. Switching gears. Last week you were asked to do a story sequence chart for one of the plays that you read. Please don't forget to bring that to class next week with you. I'm going to go over one story sequence chart, and we are going to do it today for Electra by Sophocles. In terms of the conflict, there are several in Electra, but the main conflict seems to be man versus man, and it would be either Electra versus her mother, Clytemnestra, or Orestes versus his mother. In terms of background information, we know that Electra has sent Orestes away with a servant when their father Agamemnon was killed. Electra has mourned Agamemnon ever since, and she awaits anxiously Orestes' return. She thinks that that is the only way that she can get justice for her father. The inciting incident is probably when Orestes returns. And the reason I argue that is because nothing else in the play would have happened if he had not come back. In terms of rising action, the play begins with Chrysothemis telling Electra that her mother and stepfather are plotting to put her into a dungeon because she will not stop talking about Agamemnon's death, and she won't stop mourning that. And she's making life in the palace very embarrassing and very uncomfortable. So they're going to punish her, going to put her in a dungeon and have done with her. Clytemnestra has had a bad dream. She dreams that Agamemnon has come back to life, and she realizes that that is not a good sign. Bad things are on their way. Next, in terms of rising action, the servant or the tutor returns and tells them that Orestes has died. He's lying, of course. Meanwhile, Chrysothemis tells Electra that she believes that Orestes has returned. Remember, they have a little argument about that. Has he returned? Is he dead? Orestes then returns disguised as a servant, carrying what he says is an urn full of the ashes of Orestes. Electra mourns his death. And then finally, Orestes reveals who he is to his sister and brings her into the plot to revenge Agamemnon's death on his mother and his stepfather. The tutor comes out and tells them to hurry, and so Orestes goes into the palace, and then off stage, he ends up killing his mother. According to the play, we hear screams in the background, but we don't actually see anything. So, if the conflict is between Electra and her mother, Clytemnestra, or if it's between Orestes and Clytemnestra, at what point do we know who is won? And I would argue that the climax is actually when Clytemnestra is killed. It happens off stage, but it is the high point or the climax of the play. It's when we know who has won the conflict. There's no coming back from death. From there on, we have falling action. We have Aegisthus returning. They pretend to show him the body of Orestes, and then he sees the body instead of Clytemnestra, and then the resolution or the final scene has Aegisthus being killed by Orestes. Is I would like to introduce you to the Roman playwright Plautus. I gave you a worksheet, and I'd like you to take notes as we go through this, and please bring your notes in with you next week. Plautus was born in 254 BC, and he died in 184 BC. He grew up in Umbria, which when he was born was not part of Rome, but by the time he was an adult, it had been enfolded into, it wasn't an empire at the time, but they were starting to expand their territory and take over nearby kingdoms. So he was born in Umbria, and it became part of Rome by the time he was an adult. We don't know much about his family. We know that he was not a Roman citizen, however, and that his native language was Umbrian, not Latin. He did learn to speak Latin, and he wrote his plays in Latin. We also know that he originally earned his living in theatrical work. He was a carpenter, and he helped build the sets and the scenes. He lived a very frugal lifestyle. He was able to save up some money, and he invested all of his savings into a trading venture. Unfortunately, the cargo was lost, and so he lost all of his money. He arrived back in Rome, and according to tradition, he went to work at a flour mill. And while he was working there, he composed his first 3 plays. He was able to sell them, and the success of those led to him becoming a full-time playwright. Some theater facts about Plautus. He wrote 130 plays. Only 20 of them still exist, however. According to historians, he was a wildly popular playwright during his lifetime. And he borrowed his plots from Greek plays. He rewrote them for the Roman audiences and for their tastes. Some of the theatrical innovations that he was responsible for. He was one of the big proponents of what we call new comedy. Remember that Greek theater had 3 basic types of plays. There were tragedies. Tragedies often had a sad, tragic ending, but primarily they were plays that focused on acts of the gods, characters that were kings or queens or princes or heroes. And you were supposed to learn a lesson from these plays. They also had satyr plays. Satyr plays were more like what we think of as a comedy today. They were silly and they were frivolous. And then finally they had the type of plays that they called comedies. And these were simply plays that had happy endings. They weren't the kind of comedies that we think of today. The satyr plays were more like what we think of today. Comedies were often about more normal people, but they still were written to teach a lesson. New comedies were developed by Roman playwrights. They really co-opted the satyr plays and sort of called them comedies. New comedies did have happy endings. New comedies did have story lines that followed ordinary people and just ordinary happenings. So-and-so is going to get married, so-and-so is having a party, so-and-so has arrived back from a trading venture. The new comedies that Plautus wrote and championed were purposely non-political. They were meant to be theatrical escapism, just something that you could go and you could watch and you did not learn a lesson from, and you could just escape from thoughts of the day-to-day life for an hour or so. Another innovation used and championed by Plautus was what we call the use of stock characters. He had certain characters that came up over and over and over again in his plays. He just mixed and matched them to meet the need of the play that he was writing. And we'll talk about stock characters in just a moment. Finally, an innovation used and promoted by Plautus was a limited number of plot elements, and he would just shuffle them around to produce a new play. And we'll talk about that in just a moment too. All right, stock characters. Stock characters were characters that writers such as Plautus used so that the audience could get right into the action immediately. They were looking for these characters, they were stereotypes, and it allowed the audience to understand where each of the characters were coming from without anybody having to give a lot of background information. And you see the list here. The old man, usually he was a father or a grandfather. Often he was grumpy, and often he was a drunk. Next, we have the stock character, the young man. He could have been his son. He often was angry, often was in love with somebody or amorous, and he often was portrayed as being bad with money. He was a spendthrift. He went through all of his money. Another stock character was the young lady. She might be a courtesan, she might be a long-lost noblewoman, she might be the daughter of one of the other characters. And then the final stock character was the slave. The slave, everybody knew that the slave was going to be witty, he was going to be greedy, he was going to be self-interested, he was going to try to trick his master in some way. And so all the audience members were on the same page. They knew what to expect from these characters, and they were in on the joke, if that makes sense. They were looking for the old man to be grumpy. They were looking for the young man to be a spendthrift or to be in love with someone. They were looking for the young lady or the slave character, and they were looking for ways that the slave character was going to trick somebody during the course of the play. Then there were also these stock plot elements. For example, many of the comedies involved a love triangle. In fact, the one you're going to be reading this week, Pot of Gold, involves a love triangle. Or it might involve some kind of frustrated love. There's often a plot element where somebody needs to get money from somebody else, and so there's often they're trying to trick the other person out of the money. And the person who often is being tricked as part of the plot is a father or an uncle or some authority figure. And then finally, there's often the plot element where a slave has to save his master in some way. Often the slave is sort of exasperated by having to do it, but he finally does it, and he ends up getting a reward in the end. So, as you read your final Greek tragedy this week, Alcestis, sometimes pronounced Alcestis, be on the lookout for some of these elements of a classical Greek tragedy. The characters will be legendary. Look for kings and queens. Look for gods and demigods. Also note that Euripides takes the plot directly from Greek mythology. Be on the lookout for how the chorus is going to help the plot move along and tell the audience important information and how they should be feeling about it. And then also be on the lookout for the lesson that you should be learning from watching this play, or in your case, reading this play. On the other hand, here are some things to look for in Pot of Gold. First of all, the characters are ordinary people. So be on the lookout for the stock characters that we just talked about. Also be on the lookout for the plot elements that Plautus uses in this. He uses more than one. Notice that there's a narrator. There's no chorus used in new comedies. Instead, we have a new innovation. We have a narrator. He calls himself the prologue. Be on the lookout also for characters talking directly to the audience. New comedies try to involve the audience in the action. Often the characters would run off the stage and talk directly to the audience or try to involve them in some way. Also be on the lookout for the fact that this is entertainment. You don't actually end up learning a lesson in this play. Finally, I want to mention something real quick. At one point, one of the characters in Pot of Gold says that he's going to go into town because the governor of the town is giving a donation. I wanted to mention that the Latin word donare meant to give, and so donations were a common way for wealthy individuals or the governor of a city to give out money or food or something else, trying to give away charity. And so one of the characters in the play, Pot of Gold, decides he's going to go into the city to pick up this monthly or this weekly donation. I think that summarizes the two plays that we're going to be reading this next week. Make sure that you have filled in your notes and that you bring those back to class next week with you, and we will be discussing primarily Pot of Gold, but make sure that you also read Alcestis because you're going to be having a quiz over both plays.